I think that we have to do two things. As I look at I try to look back at ancient revolutions in Greece and Rome, or what brought the Jacobins to power, or what brought the Bolsheviks to power. And I think there's two lessons. People have to be courageous and forthright and honest to oppose that. And they can't sit by the sidelines, or the minority will seize power and destroy their culture and their nation. But by the same token, I agree with you that in their zealousness to defeat that danger, they can't alienate people. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. And I voted for Donald Trump. I'm a big supporter, and we've talked about that. But the other day, he gave a speech to CPAC. It was a good speech, but at one point he said, Putin is a genius. But he gave a whole preface about all the bad things Putin did. And he meant to say that Putin had figured out us, and therefore he was a genius, and we were appeasing and weak, and therefore we were dumb. But as it came out, he didn't use a qualifying adjective. And so the headlines the next nanosecond was, Trump calls Putin a genius, his own president dumb. Whereas if he had just said, Putin is one of those evil geniuses, one of those dangerous geniuses. And if he had just said, Biden is acting tragically dumb or unfortunately dumb. So we on the right and conservatives have to be very, very careful, given the media is against us and the popular culture, to be very careful in the words we say, the expressions we use. And it's much better to be quiet and smiling and carry a club than it is to be angry and loud with a twig. So I guess my advice to conservatives is, the more that you can be civil, the more forceful you can be. And the more that you want to go down a cul-de-sac and argue and scream and yell and smear somebody, the less clout you're going to have. And I would rather have a lot of clout and not pick fights that are gratuitous.
Well, the whole idea of citizenship, I think, is that we do accord every one of our fellow human beings a degree of appropriate respect and dignity. And you've been very generous with your time, but I actually want to just read in something that Roger Kimball wrote about your book, because it summarises what we've been talking about. And I think I'm just keen for people to pick it up and read it. He says that you've shown that political freedom is inextricable from the life of citizenship. And citizenship is not a given, it's an achievement, and an achievement, moreover, that must be tended to survive. Most of history unfolded without citizens. Only subjects, serfs, slaves, and sycophants. And just as there were ages before citizenship, so we can see from our own experience that citizenship can decay and fail. Those are, I think, very powerful words, and a great summation of the ideas that you are so effective at getting across, and I'm certainly trying to get across myself as an Australian who believes in the dignity of all and the idea of people coming together in a democracy, hanging on to their freedoms, recognising that they own their freedoms, and we only surrender such freedoms as we need to for the common good by consent to government. Whereas we live in a world that wants to reverse that.
It's very fragile, and you can see that with if somebody had told me 5 years ago that Justin Trudeau would declare martial law and seize the assets of people, many of whom were protesting peacefully, and take their trucks away from them, I would never have believed it in Canada. But on the other hand, if somebody had told me 5 years ago that during the COVID lockdown, until recently in my own hometown, if you were a small mom and pop flower store or shoe owner, you would be shut down while Walmart, who sold shoes and flowers, would be wide open. And that decision would be made by an unelected bureaucrat, and it would have the force of law. I wouldn't have believed that. So we've got to be vigilant, because we have to realize that we're an aberration historically and contemporaneously. Citizenship is there's fewer democratic or constitutional governments in the world today than non-constitutional governments, and that's a natural order of things for men to be too busy or not equipped to handle the burdens of citizenship. And we can lose it at any time, even in your country. And I know I get this third hand because I'm not in your country, but it seems to me that you suffered the same perils and challenges that we did with the lockdown, and that you went after people that might have had, let's say, a very severe case of COVID with a high antibody level, and yet they either were worried about getting a vaccination because of the reaction, or I don't know. But here in the United States, as in Australia, we had people who might have had one vaccination but not the second, or they chose not to get a booster, or they were just they had very high levels of antibodies, and yet we stripped away their constitutional rights, and more importantly, we demonized them. We said they were subversives, they were going to kill us, we made them second-tier citizens. I went into New York with a restaurant, and I had the 2 Moderna shots and a case of COVID and a very high antibody level. And the person that was ahead of me was talking to me in line, and he was asking me, have you ever had an antibody test? I said, yeah, a doctor gave it to me without my knowledge, and it was 2,400, which is very high. And he said, mine was off the scale too. But he said, let's see what happens. So he went ahead of me, and they would not let him in to eat. They said, no, you can't get in here. You don't have even though natural immunity, we find out later, was as efficacious as it's effective. In most cases, it's a vaccination. And these decisions were not made in a democratic fashion. They were made by an Anthony Fauci or Mr. Collins at the CDC. So COVID, like Ukraine, have been wake-up calls, I think, to us all, that what we inherited is very, very tenuous, fragile, transitory if we're not careful.